Hi there everyone, welcome to the last session of the day. By way of introduction, my name's John Hope. I'm Senior Technology Evangelist at Sophos. Suffice to say, I've been at Sophos for practically eternity. I've had the privilege of doing loads of different jobs during that time. I won't bore you with my career history because that's what LinkedIn is for. If you feel the need to stalk me during or after this presentation, feel free. If you want to know anything about selling a dinghy, or if you want to know how to perform CPR on a dog, let me know afterwards as well, because those things constitute hobbies in my world. But it's not really about me. It is, of course, about the content that I wanted to deliver to you today. I want to talk a little bit primarily around how we can help you combat the latest generation of cyber threats. But before we launch into any kind of product pitch, it's really important to understand exactly what the need behind this is. And rather than me stand up here and tell you what I think the threat landscape looks like, I thought I would actually draw on some threat intelligence from some research that we conduct every year at Sophos, which is the State of Ransomware report. This is an independent survey, and by independent, what I mean is we commission a third-party company to carry out this research on our behalf. They interview 3,000 network administrators, IT managers, decision makers, the kind of people you would talk to on a day-to-day basis. We ask them all about their experiences of cybersecurity, but one thing we never ask them is who they're actually using by way of vendors, because all we want to get from this is information about how they experience the cyber threat landscape. It is a document that's free of charge, it's customer facing as well, and it's on the Sophos website, so feel free to download that and have a look at that in your own time. I will save you the effort of reading all of that documentation right now. I'm going to give you just a couple of the highlights. The first of which is, within that survey, 66% of the respondents experienced at least one ransomware outbreak in the 12 months running up to that survey. In fact, the average number of incidents was slightly less than 3, and our worst respondent had 16 incidents of ransomware during the 12 months running up to that survey, which, if you do the sums, is more than 1 a month. So I'm not quite sure what they were doing about cybersecurity, but it obviously wasn't the right things. If that statistic seems pretty bad, well, you're right, but it's actually exactly the same as it was last year. What this tells us is ransomware is, and it continues to be, a really significant challenge, probably the challenge which is forefront in your customers' minds. The next stat is that 76% of those attacks involved successful, from the cyber criminal's point of view, encryption of data. So most ransomware relies on the encryption and denial of access to data using the encryption methodology. That's actually gone up from 65%. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why that is in just a short while. The stat, however, that bothers me the most as a cybersecurity practitioner is that 46% of those victims who experienced encryption chose to pay the cyber criminals off. So they felt their best, or their only option, was to pay the criminals off in the hope that they got their data back. Spoiler alert, it's a really bad idea, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why it's a bad idea in just a short while. And then last but not least, the average cost of ransomware is now an eye-watering $1.82 million, which incorporates a whole bunch of factors, including things like reputational damage, regulatory fines, loss of business opportunities, so on and so forth. And that's gone up from $1.4 million last year. If that number seems crazy in relation to the kind of customers that you are dealing with, another way of phrasing that is ransomware consistently puts organizations out of business. So not too long ago, for example, a haulier in Northamptonshire was put out of business by a ransomware attack. So it's a real serious problem. So who are the victims, or who are the targets of these types of attacks? And I use the word target very deliberately. Some people still believe that ransomware is largely a random act, and it's not. Practically every incident we investigate at Sophos, we can see the telltale signs of reconnaissance and research before the attack is even launched. So we know the cyber criminals pick their victims. So let's have a little peek at who those victims are. I appreciate this is a bit of an eye chart for those of you at the back, but I'll take you through some of the highlights. So first and foremost, the sector which is most likely to be hit by ransomware is now education, with an underlying average likelihood of about 80%. And that surprised me when this latest report came out, because last time around, education was somewhere in the middle order. But the cyber criminals have woken up and they've realized that education establishments actually have a really interesting set of data. So bank account details, so kids can buy school dinners, that kind of thing. Plus things like passport scans if they're lucky enough to go on international trips. Maybe driving license scans if there's a school minibus, before you even start thinking about really interesting documents like special education need registers and those kind of things. That is coupled with the fact that education is consistently a sector which underinvests in cybersecurity. So they don't have the best tools, they don't have the best people, and therefore, from the cybercriminal's perspective, they're a soft touch and a potentially really attractive target. And you can see that motivation to be driven by ROI when you look at the opposite end of the diagram. So the sector which is least likely to be hit by ransomware is actually high technology, so IT, telecommunications, etc., etc. That is a sector which perhaps unsurprisingly invests the most in cybersecurity, has the best products, the best personnel. From the cybercriminals' perspective, of course, that means they're a really tough target, and therefore, by extension, they tend to shy away from that particular sector. So we can see behaviours here that would indicate that cybercriminals operate on an ROI model and a decision-making process that's driven by ROI in the same way that a legitimate business would operate. So who are those perpetrators? Now, the media would have you believe that a cybercriminal looks like this. A teenager wearing a hoodie, hanging out in mom's basement, basically acting in isolation. The reality, however, could not be further from the truth. Practically all ransomware worldwide is delivered by one of these major criminal gangs. And it's important to understand how highly organized these teams are. So to give you an idea about how much money they make and how they operate with high levels of impunity, this is what cybercriminals get up to in their spare time. So this is an excerpt from a YouTube video from one of the major gangs called E-Corp. And all of their fantastic supercars have that interesting urban camouflage colour scheme. The head honcho actually has a Lamborghini, which you'll see in a second. And it has a number plate on there. There it is in the background. It has a number plate on there that translates to thief. So that gives you an idea about how they can operate, really because of the territory they're in and the lack of jurisdiction around this. If you were wondering, by the way, yes, that was a pet tiger. I'm not sure how that's going to work out in the long term, but you know, if you've got millions to spend, why not? Now, we know a lot about the structure of cybercrime gangs, not because of their YouTube exploits, but actually because of this particular gang. So this is Conti. Conti is a name that you've probably heard of. Last year, in the report, Conti were the A-game players in ransomware. They were responsible for about a quarter of ransomware worldwide. Now, they've fallen quite dramatically from grace, so now they're responsible for a little less than 5% of all ransomware. The reason why they've had such a decline is because they had a very, very public disagreement over Ukraine, as it happens. So Conti, being a Russian-led gang, at the start of the Ukrainian conflict, came out and said very publicly, yeah, well, maybe we're cyber criminals, but we also believe in what Russia is doing, and we will support Russia's activities using cyber means. The problem in this scenario is that about half the affiliates inside Conti are Ukrainians, or at least were Ukrainians. They weren't really quite on board with that particular message, and Conti disintegrated very, very publicly. So we had all sorts of documentation leaks, including alleged links to organizations like the FSB, full list of gang members, operating procedures, manuals, and a lot about organizational structure. So you need to be thinking less teenager in basement, more monthly salary, monthly target, line manager, HR department, marketing department. Does it sound familiar? It's basically the mirror of a legitimate business in every way except the way they're actually going about making their money. So there's a little about the perpetrators. What's it like if you're actually at the sharp end of a ransomware attack? Well, first and foremost, the demands that your customers will see when they arrive at work will already have been calculated by the cyber criminals, because they know fine well that if they demand £1 million out of Mrs. Miggins' bakery down the road with 3 employees, they're not going to get a payout. There's no way they would even attempt that. They could just walk away. So the cybercriminal gangs target their demands based on your ability to pay as an organization. And to give you an idea how focused they can be, we once investigated an attack on a manufacturing company up in the Nordics. And they came to us and they said, we've been hit by a ransomware attack. They're demanding the equivalent of £950,000. What do we do? Because we can't afford to pay that. We've only got 50 employees. Simultaneously, as well as talking to us, they also attempted to negotiate with cyber criminals. Now, the cyber criminals immediately came back to them with an email with a copy of the cyber insurance certificate that they'd stolen from the network. They said, look, guys, you're insured for £1 million. Therefore, our demand of £950,000 is actually pretty reasonable. I suggest you pay it. So that's the kind of level that these people will go to. As well as getting those demands, of course, there is inevitably going to be business impact. Our survey tells us that if you get hit by ransomware, the likelihood of experiencing some kind of significant business impact is 84%. I find that really hard to believe, because how that is not 100% in today's world where we rely on technology so much, I have no idea. But nevertheless, that's what statistics tell us. The ransom demands themselves, you can see there's been a significant right shift. So the light blue in this graph are ransom demands from last year. The dark blue is this year. You'll see there's a significant shift towards demands in excess of $1 million. And obviously, when you get hit by a demand of that kind of nature, the obvious question is, Should I be advising my customers to pay that ransom demand? And listen, it's really easy for me as a cybersecurity vendor to say, absolutely never engage with the cyber criminals. However, if I'm in a hospital and the doctors can't access patient records, or I'm standing in a factory that's silent because the machines no longer know how to make widgets, that conversation's a little bit more difficult. However, ideally, if we can avoid paying the cyber criminals, that is definitely a good thing. There are 3 reasons primarily why it's a bad idea. The first is the moral and ethical argument. If we stopped paying ransomware demands tomorrow, then presumably the cyber criminals will all go out and get 9 to 5s, because then no one's going to get any money into the door. By paying the cyber criminals off, we're effectively perpetuating the problem. We're encouraging more people into the industry, actually, and that problem is never going to go away. It's also really bad from an ROI perspective. On average, you'll get about 60% of your data back when you pay the cyber criminals off. You can't choose that 60%, and you can't choose the format it comes back in. So it's a pretty poor return on investment. And then last but not least, most cybercrime gangs operate what is delightfully called a sucker list. This is essentially a cybercriminal CRM system. These are the people we've hit, these are the people that paid out, and if you pay out, you are likely to gravitate towards the top of that list. Think back to that organization that got hit 16 times over, they were probably somewhere at the top of the sucker list, and because of their continued payments, they basically just invited more ransomware into the organization. Sometimes people think that paying the criminals off is a quick win, and it's actually not. So, like I said, you'll get the data back, maybe. The tools are not the best. They're not necessarily thoroughly tested. You may not be able to choose the structure of the data, and let's be honest, would you trust that data anyway after it's been through some kind of attack of that nature? Statistics tell us it's significantly quicker to restore using a backup. And it might even make you less of a target. So the second most likely sector to be hit by ransomware is manufacturing and production. Now, these guys do not hold a massive amount of data, but what they do is they back it all up. They have the best backup regimes of any sector. Now, if you've got a factory full of widget-making machines, you make pretty certain your widget template is backed up and stored in multiple locations. It kind of stands to reason. And the cyber criminals know this. So traditionally, they have avoided that particular sector because their likelihood of getting a payout, given that backups exist, is pretty poor. Also, using backups are going to reduce the cost. So it's typically half the price to recover and restore using a backup as opposed to paying the cyber criminals off and then hoping for the best. Feels like I'm selling backups at this point. I'm not. Sophos don't do backups, but it's obviously a really important part of a decent cybersecurity strategy. Sounds like somebody over there might be able to help you out. There you go. Have a chat later on. I will temper that, however, and I'm sorry to disappoint you, but backups are not a silver bullet that solves all problems. We are increasingly seeing what are called double dip or double extortion attacks. It was alluded to earlier on in one of the other presentations. This is where the cyber criminals will not only encrypt your data, but they also steal it. And they kind of got you one way or the other then. Because if you don't pay because you've got a backup, they'll just threaten to publicize that. It's called doxing in cybercrime parlance, basically publicizing that information and trashing your reputation that way. So backups are absolutely an important part of a cybersecurity regime, but it's not a silver bullet that solves all of those challenges. Now, I want to emphasize that practically all ransomware is financially motivated, but we are starting to see some interesting deviations from that path, and we're starting to see ransomware being used as a political weapon as well. So remember our friends at Conti? Well, what they did next, those that stayed true to the cause, if you will, they embarked on a bunch of nuisance attacks, picking on organizations all across the world. My particular point of interest is the satellite communications company on the left-hand side. These guys were providing satellite communications in Eastern Europe, and Conti attacked them literally hours before the first troops crossed the border. Make of that what you will, but obviously this is an attempt to disrupt military and civilian communications in the area. In the interest of checks and balances, we have seen ransomware being used in the opposite direction as well, and one of my personal favorite anecdotes, which also inspired the title, if anybody was scratching their head about what I was on about, is this particular tale of Belarus. So Russia's military might is typically located in the north of the country, and if you're going to invade a country, then moving the military equipment is absolutely critical. Transpires that Belarus is quite a convenient shortcut on the way to the Ukraine. So Moscow approached Minsk and asked if it was okay to use their railway network to start moving tanks, military equipment, and personnel across the territory. Now, Minsk, being largely sympathetic to Moscow, allowed these trains to flow. However, there were a bunch of disenfranchised citizens inside Belarus that were not happy seeing their public railway network being utilised in that way. And they went out on platforms like Twitter to say, essentially, if you allow these trains to continue to flow, then we will take the network down. And lo and behold, that is exactly what they did. So they launched ransomware against the Belarusian railway network, not for the purposes of making money, but instead to essentially paralyze the network. So overnight, Belarusian railway networks moved from a model of having fancy signal boxes and computer automation through to literally pulling levers and waving flags in some cases to move trains across the network. Somebody said the other day in Glasgow that was a little like levelling up to the UK railway network, which I thought was unfair, but actually given today's transport chaos, maybe there's some point in that. Now, essentially, the point of this story is eventually cyber partisans got their way and the Belarusian railway network gave up. And it still took them about a month, even with the decryption keys, to get back up and running. Obviously, during that time, causing significant impact to the citizens in Belarus, not being able to get around. But also, and perhaps for the first time ever, we're seeing cyber means having an influence on the outcome of a military campaign. So moving from the digital world into affecting the physical world. Now, maybe I've painted a little bit of a bleak picture about the state of cybersecurity. And you might be wondering, well, why is the situation as bad as it is? Ransomware is not new. Amy mentioned earlier on, ransomware in its current format has been around for at least 10 years. So why aren't we better at combating it? What are the challenges behind that? Now, my personal view, not Sophos' view, but my personal view, is there are 3 really significant challenges that are happening in the world of cyber right now that adds together to give us this perfect wave of ransomware. The first of which actually relates back to the criminal gangs themselves. Now, one of the side effects of coalescing into groups is that human beings actually learn better together in groups. It's why we have schools. Cyber criminals have been able to share ideas internally around code and also share between gangs in certain cases. There are forums and that kind of thing where they can exchange ideas. Net result, the quality of the code, the capabilities that are ransomware themselves have actually gone up. This is why we now see 76% of successful encryption attacks as opposed to 65%. The quality of the underlying capabilities are better. We also, and it's been covered during some of the other sessions as well, is we've also seen this new wave of the human being being the interesting target. As we get better at defending IT systems, all of a sudden the human being becomes a really interesting thing for cyber criminals. And we do kind of make it easy for them. If you think about the things that we publish online, all of those scraps of intelligence are euphemistically referred to as open source intelligence by the cyber criminals. Many of them have social engineering departments, and the whole purpose is basically to work out who the victim is and then explore their digital footprint. What do they do? What are their hobbies? Where do they play golf? What are their children's names? What are their pets' names? All of this stuff is really, really useful information if you're going to craft a phishing attack against one of these victims. It's not anymore about your rich uncle who's just passed away and we just need your bank account details. It's more like you play golf at this club, they have an event on this day, you are attending, here's a form you need to fill out for your dietary requirements. Why wouldn't you click on that link? Because it fits your reality so perfectly that you're going to fall for it. And I would defy anybody to be able to spot every single phishing attack out there. Yes, user training is great, but if we can actually reduce our digital footprints, that's going to go a long way. So next time you're talking to your customers and giving them some advice, just ask them to think a little bit about their digital footprint and what they're exposing, because I guarantee you that intelligence will be used against them at some point in the future. And the last problem, which is actually conveniently the one I want to focus on for the rest of this session, is the fact that we've seen a significant shift in cybercrime tactics whereby the criminals are now using legitimate business tools against organizations. It's no longer a case that criminals break in. In many cases, the cyber criminals are simply logging in. They're using legitimate business tools like RDP and PowerShell and the stuff that either your customers or you guys use every single day in those environments, and they're just turning those tools against organizations. It's called living off the land. And it causes an enormous problem for any cybersecurity vendor. Because all of a sudden, technology, things like artificial intelligence, they fall down at this point. Because how on earth could you expect technology to tell the difference, for example, between John legitimately logging in, so John can do John's stuff, versus my identity being used, and then the cyber criminals exploiting that access to do whatever nefarious deed they've got in mind. Technology is not going to solve that problem. Now, traditionally, what we might have said is go out and buy a bunch of searching tools. Go and buy XDR. Go and sit there and look at all the telemetry and work out what's going on in the estate and act accordingly. The problem is, in many cases, particularly for end users, going out and buying some search tools is a little bit akin to me going out and buying a set of boxing gloves. Doesn't necessarily equip me to be a fighter. Buying search tools does not make you a threat analyst. Being a good IT manager does not make you a threat analyst either, by the way. They are very distinctly different disciplines. And it's a real shame, actually, because in many of the attacks that we investigate, we see the precursory signs long, in some cases, before the actual attack takes root. So one of my personal favorite anecdotes is, again, another manufacturing company in the UK this time. They were penetrated by an IAB. So they left an RDP server online, and they'd left it sitting there after the pandemic, and people had forgotten about it. It was protected by a really weak username and password. And the cyber criminals got hold of it. It was an asset that was bought and sold. Long story short, the organization was hit 5 times over in the space of 28 days. And if you can imagine in that scenario, particularly because in one case they were actually resident in the estate before launching ransomware for about 15, 16 days, there must be loads of telemetry, how they got in, how they moved laterally, how they exfiltrated data out of the organization, way before they actually pushed the button and launched ransomware. In fact, as many as 83% of cases, bearing in mind the cyber criminal standard MO is you delete all of the logs and archives after you've finished, we can see there are warning signs. However, in the defense of our beleaguered end users and the MSPs who support them, trying to find that one log line of information that tells you you're about to become a victim is nigh on impossible. Think about how much telemetry is created on a day-to-day basis inside an average organization. You've got your endpoints, your firewalls, your access points, your switches, your routers, so on and so forth. All of them telling you loads of information, and that one nugget of information might be buried in there somewhere. And it doesn't help that cyber criminals deliberately target organizations at the worst possible time. They know, for example, that most organizations are not monitoring telemetry out of hours, so most ransomware attacks begin out of hours, typically on Monday night to Tuesday morning. They will then stay resident in the network for potentially quite a long time. We've recently launched a new active adversary report, which draws on intelligence from our own threat analysts and our own threat research. The average dwell time is now 5 days. So you're reducing the window of opportunity to spot an attack is in progress before eventually the cyber criminals steal the data, if they're going to do a double extortion attack, and then encrypt the network, which is often the first time an administrator realizes there's actually a problem going on at all. If I was to summarize all of that stuff, essentially we believe at Sophos now that cybersecurity has become too much of a challenge for most organizations to deal with effectively on their own. It is no longer a game of us creating cybersecurity products, chucking them over the fence and hoping that our users are smart enough and capable enough to actually deal with them. That reality is gone. We believe instead so passionately, and this is where we need your support, that managed detection and response services are the way forward. So what we're offering here is a 24/7 security operations center staffed by experts monitoring our customers' telemetry, monitoring their estates, recognizing the telltale signs of an attack, particularly the kind of attacks that would otherwise go under the radar. The sorts of things that would go unnoticed, like the exfiltration of data, the movement laterally across the estate, using tools like Mimikatz to harvest usernames and passwords, as just a couple of examples. So what do we do with our MDR team? Well, our MDR team are all about collating telemetry. We pull in as much telemetry as we possibly can from an organization, and that will obviously include our own security products. We haven't forgotten about those. We're still very much in the business of creating endpoint protection, server protection, firewalls, etc., etc. But we are aware that we are not the only cybersecurity vendor out there. Your customers may well have invested in a bunch of other cybersecurity technologies. You may well be promoting other cybersecurity technologies. So we can take in telemetry from, for example, the Microsoft estate and a whole bunch of third-party endpoint vendors as well. We also take in telemetry from other types of organizations as well, so other firewalls, other identity providers, your public cloud infrastructure, your email providers, etc., etc., etc. Essentially, the message to the customer and the message to you as partners are, if you have a bunch of tools you've bought and you have a bunch of tools that you like, that's okay. Our MDR service in most cases will work alongside them. We're not having conversations anymore about ripping and replacing technology. There is no appetite for that. The budget isn't there. The appetite for risk isn't there. You've probably got tools that you're already familiar with, and there's nothing wrong with that. We will work with those in many, many cases. And I wanted to give you a particular example, actually, because I think the Microsoft ecosystem is probably our strongest integration and has the most to offer. Of course, Microsoft is pretty much ubiquitous in most organizations these days. And their platforms and technologies give us a huge array of telemetry that we can draw on. So things like identity provision, maybe Microsoft Defender running on the endpoints, for example, then your public cloud infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of this is really good data. The problem fundamentally is all of that data is buried in one of potentially multiple different dashboards. We will take all of that telemetry. Now, whether it be from Sophos, whether it be from Microsoft or any of the other security vendors, everything goes through this process. We standardize, we normalize, we boil it down to the root cause of the problem, and then we give it to an analyst, which sounds really easy, doesn't it? But I'll give you a couple of examples of some of the things that we have to do. In the purple section there, we do a clean and enrich. And this is one of the big challenges around cybersecurity, because if you take alerts from different vendors, you will find different alert schemas. Some will tell you this is threat level 1, some will tell you this is threat level 9, somebody will tell you that it's level low, medium, or high. What does that mean? What is the standard? So we normalize everything into a standardized schema. So when our analysts look at it, they know exactly what we're talking about. But the real secret sauce behind our service is really the correlation engine. So I'll give you an example of that. We once investigated a phishing attack, an organization with 250 seats. They were hit by phishing. Their endpoint provider, which happened to be Microsoft, generated, I think it was 200 alerts. And then the email provider, which happened to be Mimecast, also generated about 200 alerts. So there's 400 alerts for an analyst to look at. It's not sustainable. Our back-end system correlates all of this together, pops it into a single alert. I'll show you what that looks like. So a single standardized normal alert. So you don't worry about this, by the way. You'll never see this. This is very much behind the scenes of what we do. Everything is standardized. So when our analysts look at it, this is one threat alert. It maps to MITRE technique T1192. If any of you are nerdy enough, yes, that is a spear phishing attack with a link. And that's what analysts see. They see exactly what the IOCs and the TTPs are. So where did this attack come from? Who are the recipients of this attack? What URL is it inviting people to go to? What attachments are there? Everything that analyst needs to know in order to conduct a threat search. The process of going through that entire funnel takes all of 1 minute. It takes longer to explain than it actually happens in reality. And that's really important because we want our human expertise to be on top of that as quickly as we possibly can. It then takes, on average, about 25 minutes for our analysts to then work out, is this a real problem? If it is a real problem, what's the scope of the problem? What do we do about it next? And then there's a fork in the road choice. So as a customer of MDR, we can give the end user organization all the indicators that need, and they can go and embark on the threat hunt themselves. We could call you guys, and you can be the heroes that go in and save the day because we'll tell you exactly what the problem is and how to fix it. Alternatively, we can actually fix the problem on your behalf. And in that case, it takes a further 12 minutes to roll out the scripts, kick out the bad guys, shut down malicious accounts, so on and so forth. So we're leaving the estate in a clean format. And that's essentially what you're buying as part of our MDR service. It's that mean time to respond of 38 minutes. Now, I appreciate that may be a number that you have no context around. So the closest analyst investigation I could find was a Gartner report that compared individual security operations centers internally and looked at their response times. Excuse me. The lowest time to respond was 3.7 hours. The longest time to respond was 30 hours. The median was 16 hours. 16 hours is an eternity. And it's an eternity in which nothing good is going to happen. 16 hours worth of time with the cyber criminals running around your estate. They're going to be stealing data, leaving back doors, encrypting data. Nothing positive is going to happen in that time. So reference that against 38 minutes. Delivering better security outcomes by shutting down the problem as quickly as we possibly can. But there's more that we can do as well. So we are the world's largest provider of cybersecurity as a service. We have 18,500 organizations using this service already. If you added our closest two competitors together, you still wouldn't get to that number. And I'm not saying that to be arrogant. The reason I'm saying that is we have a rich source of telemetry that we can use. Every one of our threat hunts that we conduct has useful information which we bake into our product. So there's a team of 500 people at Sophos that do nothing other than work this wheel. So we investigate an incident, we use the telemetry to solve the immediate problem, but then we walk it over to Sophos Labs. Think back to that phishing example. The telemetry we gleaned from Microsoft, the telemetry we gleaned from Mimecast, both of those things went to Sophos Labs. We carried out our own threat investigation to make sure it was all legitimate data, and then we build it into our product. And we do that in 60 minutes. It takes 60 minutes to go through that wheel. In other words, if one of our MDR customers, one of those 18,500 organizations on the other side of the world gets hit by an attack within an hour, everybody else is protected against that attack. It's a bit like buying into a huge cybersecurity club where everybody benefits from those experiences. So it's a huge additional value, which is sometimes overlooked with these services, and I think it's really good to investigate that in more detail. Now, a couple of things that you might be thinking of in terms of objections. So it sounds great in principle, but you might be thinking, well, I've got people already. What happens to them? Very, very valid question. A couple of things. A really good administrator is not a really good threat hunter. There's your first point. Secondly, if you have got a security team, good for you. That's great. I mean, it is genuinely really refreshing to see people investing in cybersecurity people as well as technologies. However, I would always question, what are those people actually doing? Again, think of that phishing attack with 400 alerts. That's a lot for an analyst to deal with. They're probably playing this game that I like to call alert whack-a-mole. Right, multiple different consoles, multiple alerts, all vying for attention. Your analyst is spending more time dismissing those alerts than actually doing anything productive. I can take that SOC analyst and I can make him super sharp because I can tell him exactly what the problem is, exactly which devices are affected, and exactly what to do to go and fix that problem. So it's a hugely collaborative exercise, which you guys are absolutely part of. So we can work alongside security teams where they exist, but the reality is most MSPs, most end users, they do not have a security team. And if they do have a security team, it is not working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's okay, because cybersecurity is now a team sport, and we will help you with that. When we onboard a new MDR partner, when we onboard new MDR customers, in every one of those situations, we always assess what is the end user's capability, what is the partner's capability, where do we fit in? So we offer our MDR service that meets you where you are in terms of your own personnel, your own ability to respond, and your own processes to respond. And of course, also working around your existing technology stack as well. Essentially, MDR meeting you where you are today. So I've covered a lot, and I appreciate there's a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time. So just in order to summarize, ransomware is and continues to be a major cybersecurity challenge. A challenge which, in our opinion, is too great for most organizations to be able to deal with effectively. Which is why we offer our 24/7 security team as a bunch of experts that augment your capabilities and allow you to do really, really effective cybersecurity right now without having to make a single hire or invest in any in-house technology. It's a service that's literally sitting there and it's waiting to go. And it works with your existing people, it works with existing processes, and it works with the existing technology stack that you've put out there as well.